Hey everybody, Johnny here. I know it's been quite a long time since I last made a video on this channel. I have to admit I have been very busy with graduate school, but it is Christmas break and I have some time to bring you some interesting stories from American history. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about not just American history, but also Polish history. This video is about the Polish soldiers who served in the American Civil War. So let's get started.
We appreciate the courtesy of the makers of Spry, sponsors of Aunt Jenny's real-life stories, in relinquishing their program today in order for us to bring you the following special broadcast.
In 1938, the remains of an American Civil War veteran from Poland named Wlodzimierz Krzyzanowski were transferred to Arlington National Cemetery for reburial. With both Germany and Russia breathing down Poland's neck and World War II on the verge of breaking out, Americans found the memorialization of heroic Poles all the more timely. Krzyzanowski's reburial was broadcast nationally by radio and included an address from President Franklin D. Roosevelt.
Ours has been a long and unbroken friendship with the people of Poland. From the days of our struggle to achieve nationhood, unbroken by any rift through the century and a half of our life as a nation, the American people and the people of Poland have maintained a friendship based on this common spiritual ideal.
Roosevelt's common spiritual ideal, which linked the Polish cause to the American project, was a centuries-old idea by the time of these utterances. The names of two Polish soldiers who fought in the American Revolution, Tadeusz Kościuszko and Kazimierz Puławski, were widely known and revered throughout the United States. Puławski died in an heroic charge at the Battle of Savannah, while Kościuszko, whose monument still stands in front of the White House, returned to Poland after the war and joined an uprising for Polish independence. Though it would end in a crushing defeat, the 1791 uprising gave birth to the Polish Constitution. The US and Poland were for a brief moment the only two countries in the world with constitutional governments. While President Roosevelt may have celebrated Krzyzanowski's service on the eve of World War II, during Krzyzanowski's own time as a soldier in the 1860s, the US had an opportunity to support Polish nationhood, yet they refused. Why did they do this? Well, let's dive in. America's introduction to Polish exiles in the 19th century occurred in the aftermath of a failed November Uprising in 1830. Some 5,000 to 7,000 Poles connected with this uprising fled to the United States, where the legacies of Puławski and Kościuszko had engendered sympathy for the Polish cause. In 1834, 234 veterans of the November Uprising who had been forcibly exiled from Poland founded the Polish Committee to collect donations and write pro-Polish articles in the American press. Members like Henryk Kałusowski, a veteran of the November Uprising, transformed the organization into something more radical, the Polish Democratic Society, which focused on deepening ties with emigre organizations in Europe. Kałusowski also served in the U.S. Treasury Department and leveraged his connections to fund two Polish colonization projects, including one in Cobb County, Virginia, now West Virginia, in the late 1840s. Cobb County accepted many new exiles after the failed Mirosławski Rebellion of 1846, which sent waves of refugees to America, including Wlodzimierz Krzyzanowski. Krzyzanowski was born in 1824 in Prussian Poland and received his education in Poznań, a hotbed of revolutionary activity. Under the more liberal rule of Frederick IV, Prussian Poles enjoyed a much freer environment where Polish traditions and culture could be preserved. Poland was at the time a country that did not actually exist on a map, although it existed in the heart of every Pole. It was under a partition between Austria, Germany, and Russia at the time. Now, on the Russian side, I hate you. I hate you so much. Whatever. On the Russian side, where the reactionary Tsar Nicholas I reigned, Polish schools, universities, and military academies were closed, and the teaching of Polish language was forbidden. Steeped in his people's tradition, Krzyzanowski joined Mirosławski's revolt in 1846, which was betrayed by conspirators before it even began. Fearing arrest, Krzyzanowski's family raised money and sent him to America. He arrived in New York around 1850 and quickly befriended members of the Polish Democratic Society. Krzyzanowski moved to Kałusowski's colony in Cabell County, boy, that was hard to say, and remained there until its closure in 1852. Relocating to Washington, D.C., he married into an established American family and opened a pottery business blocks from the U.S. Capitol. He was an active anti-slavery Republican at the time of Abraham Lincoln's election to the presidency in 1860, and the pursuant Civil War prompted him to enlist as a private in the Union Army on April 11, 1861. As an active member of the Polish exile community, he was able to raise enough volunteers to register Krzyzanowski's company with the U.S. Army and earn a promotion to the captain of rank, also known as to the rank of captain. Oops, whatever. In July, he re-enlisted as a major and opened a recruiting office at 246 Broadway Street, where he recruited over 400 volunteers. The deed earned him yet another promotion to colonel, and with it, a much higher paycheck. While Krzyzanowski climbed the ranks, another Polish soldier serving in the Union Army, Ludwik Zychlinski, complained of a rigid system that privileged wealthier, more established Americans.
Any person can become a major or captain or even a colonel if he has the money.
Zychlinski had only just arrived in the United States in the spring of 1861 after completing a year's service in Giuseppe Garibaldi's army in Sicily. He chose America in order to gain, quote, practical experience on the battlefields of the New World before the Civil War should end. So he was rushing to get to the United States and participate in the Civil War to gain practical battle experience. Can you imagine such a thing? Upon joining the Independent Battalion of New York Volunteer Infantry, an immigrant unit known as Les Enfants Perdus, on April 26, 1862, Zychlinski was disappointed to learn that all officer positions were taken by French and German soldiers.
The military organization and administration are terrible. Both are in the hands of speculators and businessmen, not people with a heart full of love for the fatherland.
At the same time, Zychlinski was awed to serve in the most technologically advanced army in the world.
Europe cannot invent anything new. On the contrary, it can only learn everything from the United States because even in the time of battle, we already had field telegraphs joining divisions and brigades.
Telegraph communication on the battlefield may have impressed Zychlinski, but it was the telegraph communications across the Atlantic Ocean that ensured Polish soldiers could keep up with events back home in Poland. Polish soldiers eagerly read the dispatches from Europe in the New York Tribune, Herald, and Times. Stories tended to follow a pattern. There would be an anniversary of a past uprising in Poland, or perhaps a funeral for a famous Pole who fought in a previous uprising. And at these events, there would appear revolutionary banners, people would shout slogans. These gatherings would sometimes turn into mass demonstrations or protests against the Tsar, and the Russian authorities would then clamp down, and often protesters would get killed. In February 1861, Russian Cossacks clashed with a crowd of mourners at the funeral of a Polish revolutionary in Warsaw, killing 5. The event was dubbed the Warsaw Massacre, and coverage in the United States took a characteristically pro-Polish stance. An atrocious massacre of unarmed men, reported the New York Times, which recalls the most ferocious type of old Muscovite dragonade. The funeral for the 5 killed in Warsaw turned into an even bigger demonstration, which ended in the arrests of hundreds who sought sanctuary inside the church. Stories like these fueled a sense of urgency among Polish soldiers like Ludwik Zychlinski to return home and join the fight.
Across the ocean, I yearned for the homeland because of the sad occurrences in Warsaw described in newspapers and commentaries.
On January 14, 1863, Russian authorities responded to growing unrest by attempting to rid themselves of the revolutionary Polish youth through a massive draft in Warsaw and other cities. This act would prove the spark that set off the revolution. A vanguard council known as the Central National Committee rose up and issued a proclamation declaring itself the only legal government of Poland and called all Polish citizens to arms. Local militias, composed in part of those who managed to evade the recent draft, assembled and attacked Russian guard posts and forts across the country. News reached the Polish exile community in America with guarded hope. Poland's dreams had been crushed before. Still, Ludwik Zychlinski read encouraging news in letters from his Paris comrades.
They wrote that Napoleon III loudly promised to give help to the Poles, and they even indicated that Austria would not be opposed to forming an independent Polish kingdom as a balance of power with Russia.
On March 15th, New York's exile community gathered at Steuben Hall, where the Central National Committee's proclamation was read. Countrymen, Chairman John Sidrowski opened the meeting. Again our fatherland, rising from our grave, stretches out to her sons her hands, covered with wounds, produced by Russian chains. Attendees formed the Polish Central Committee in the United States to collect donations and influence the narrative in the press. Its members included Henryk Kałusowski and Wlodzimierz Krzyzanowski. Krzyzanowski initially considered returning to the United States upon news of the uprising, but ultimately decided he could not escape his obligations to the Union Army. Earlier that year, the Congress had bestowed upon him the rank of Brigadier General. Zychlinski, too, was bound by a 3-year contract.
I cursed the hour in which I enlisted in the ranks of the United States, where the allegiance and military honor so deeply inscribed in the heart of every Pole bound me.
Eventually, following a long and persistent letter-writing campaign, Zychlinski was released from his contract and allowed to return to Poland. Now, it should have been easy for the Exile Committee to enlist support among the American public, especially considering the negative view most Americans held of Russia. Few countries were seen by Americans as more repressive and undemocratic than Tsarist Russia. However, since the outbreak of the Civil War, Russia had been one of the only great powers in Europe to express support for the Union. During the 1861 Trent Affair, which was a major diplomatic crisis between the US and Great Britain, Russian Foreign Minister Prince Alexander Gorchakov sent a magnanimous letter of support to US Secretary of State William H. Seward. Relations were put to a second test when French Emperor Napoleon III requested Russia's support in a forced mediation to stop the American Civil War. Tsar Alexander II wrote to President Abraham Lincoln expressing unequivocal support for the Union cause. He described Russia and the United States as a natural community of interests and of sympathies, two countries placed at the extreme ties of the two worlds, both in the ascending period of their development. Russia ultimately rejected Napoleon's offer of a joint mediation, imbuing the Lincoln government with a deep sense of gratitude at the moment the Polish uprising began. But the final act of Russia's diplomatic coup occurred in September 1863, when the Russian Navy unexpectedly appeared in New York Harbor. Years earlier, when the Crimean War had broken out, British blockades trapped the Russian Navy inside the Baltic Sea. Concerned the Polish uprising might set off a larger European war, Prince Gorchakov ordered the vessels out of the Baltic to the oceanic ports of the friendly United States. New Yorkers were still reading the death tolls from the recent Union defeat at Chickamauga when the ships appeared. Desperately in need of a morale boost, Americans celebrated the Russian Navy's arrival. On the decks of the flagship Alexander Nevsky, New York Mayor George Updike enthusiastically greeted Rear Admiral Alexander Lisovsky, commander of the Russian fleet, while a band struck up Yankee Doodle. Russian sailors were treated to festivals, bombastic street parades, and a dinner at Manhattan's premier restaurant, Delmonico's. In early November, the New York Times reported on a Russian ball at the Academy of Music. In its jocular coverage of the, quote, long-expected event of the season, the Times expressed a change in the public mood toward Russia. America prefers no judgment of favor or disfavor upon the internal policy of Russia. We simply recognize with the warmth and frankness which becomes us the justice, forbearance, courtesy, and respect with which Russia has borne herself toward us from the outset. Warm feelings awakened further at news of the Russian ships arriving in San Francisco Bay and Washington, D.C. President Lincoln reportedly drank a toast to the health of the Tsar, which received mocking treatments in the Confederate press. The Tsar emancipates the serfs from their bondage of centuries and puts forth the whole strength of his empire to enslave the Poles. Lincoln proclaims freedom to the African and strives at the same time to subjugate free-born Americans. Others in the North saw no hypocrisy whatsoever, expressing pride in the friendship between two peoples engaged in a struggle for liberation. Needless to say, in such an environment of friendliness towards Russians, the Polish exiles found it difficult to get their message out. The Polish committee only mustered about $16,000 in donations for the Polish cause. A New York City-wide celebration of the November Uprising in 1863 was very poorly attended. And Henry Kałusowski, who often had the ear of all the reporters in Washington, D.C., began complaining that no one would take his calls anymore, or I guess his knocks, since it was the 19th century. Anyway, by the end of the year, New York Tribune editor Horace Greeley had pronounced the Polish cause queerly out of fashion in America. Thus, it was no surprise that when Napoleon III invited the U.S. to join a written protest against Russia's treatment of the Poles, Secretary of State William Henry Seward declined, citing America's non-intervention policy. Imagine that, an American non-intervention policy. My, how times have changed. By the time Ludwik Zychlinski finally arrived in Poland, the last of the major battles had been fought, and the repressions under a Russian general named Mikhail Muravyov, known as the Hangman, were already underway. Zychlinski spent the remainder of 1863 conducting small cavalry raids and fighting skirmishes against the Russians with ill-trained soldiers plucked from the villages. His experience leading, quote, a handful of poorly armed Poles drew a sharp contrast to his service in the U.S. Army. But Zychlinski cheered his comrades for having the, quote, courage and heart to stand against the Tsar. By December, i.e. by the end of the year, the uprising had ended, Zychlinski was arrested and exiled to Siberia. Ultimately, the presence of Polish exiles in the Union Army was insufficient to significantly shift either public opinion or U.S. government policy against Russia during the Polish uprising of 1863. Despite the decidedly pro-Polish bent of the American press and the efforts of exile organizations like the Polish Democratic Society, Polish soldiers only comprised about 7,000 of the some 2 million men who served in the Union Army. Wlodzimierz Krzyzanowski was only one of 3 Polish officers who received the rank of Brigadier General during the entire Civil War. The common spiritual ideal that President Roosevelt talked about many years later, shared by Poland and the United States, could not overcome a realpolitik. Russia's support for the United States was simply too vital, both as a check on Britain and France and as a morale boost for the war-weary Union. Poland would have to wait until the end of World War I, when the balance of power that kept it divided was destroyed. By then, the United States, unencumbered by a civil war and under the leadership of an interventionist president named Woodrow Wilson, was prepared to storm into Europe and lend weight to the national aspirations of the Poles. Well, that'll do it for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. It's been about 5 months since I've posted on this channel, but this channel is still going strong. We are still a fantastic, great channel here, and there's going to be lots of videos coming in the future. It's just they're not going to be coming quite as frequently as before because I am very bogged down with my studies. So, however, if I can find a way to sort of mix and match my studies with the topics I talk about on the channel, it's possible that I will be able to post more frequently. But I don't expect to be posting every week or even every 2 weeks. Maybe once a month. We'll see. If you're really jonesing for some One Human History content, I think I have like maybe over 50, maybe even 100 videos already. So go back and watch some of the old ones. There's some great videos in there, and they're about history. So even though they weren't filmed yesterday, they're still relevant. So thanks so much for tuning in. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to my channel for more content, and have a wonderful new year. Happy 2023. Do widzenia.